Hello everyone, welcome to week 3. I hope you had a good week too. You'll notice that this week I have several different videos set out for you. So this will be the primary one with the content for the week when we're going to talk about bipolar disorders. You'll probably want to spend a significant amount of time looking at bipolar disorders in your DSM, as it is a diagnosis that you're going to see a fair amount of. So make sure you read through them and ask any questions or give any examples in the discussion board. We're also going to have a shorter video that's going to look specifically at the biopsychosocial assessment that you have coming up, and I'll do another one at the very beginning of the week once I see all of your posts for the case studies that you did from last week too, so I can talk through those just a little bit. So starting off today, we're going to talk about bipolar disorders, and these are now a separate section. They're separated from the depressive disorders, which is what they were previously. So they're now their own standalone category, which is probably a good idea since it is something that you're going to see a fair amount, and it is significantly different than general depressive disorders. The primary characteristic that you're going to see is the manic and hypomanic episodes. So you're going to see that this is going to look different on bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. The manic episode is going to be the extreme happiness, the extreme irritability, especially in younger people. You'll see more of the irritability than the happiness. A lot of hyperactivity, a lot of feeling like all of a sudden you can get a lot done in a short period of time, feeling like you don't even need to stop for sleep or taking breaks. You'll often see people with racing thoughts and also rapid speech in this state. The manic episodes tend to be shorter than the depressive episodes, but the depressive episodes are actually what people tend to think is the bigger problem. So when you're in a manic episode, you tend to feel pretty good, you think things are going well, you're finally able to accomplish a lot. It's when you're in the depressive episode that you're not feeling very happy with how things are going. So usually when people come into treatment by choice, it's going to be because they've been in that depressive episode. And that's going to look similar to other depressive episodes, depressive disorders, where you have the extreme sadness, no energy, you're not interested in doing anything, maybe you just want to stay in bed all day, things that you used to enjoy you really don't enjoy right now, and also those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. Someone with a bipolar disorder might have long spaces in between when they have the cycle between the manic episode and the depressive episode. So it is possible that you have a stable mood in between that manic and depressive periods. So note that cycle might be very different for people. It says up to 3 years, but it might be very short. It might be only a couple of weeks. So note that it could be very different depending on the individual. This section is going to include bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymic disorder. Just like most of the disorders, we don't really know what causes bipolar disorder. It looks like it's probably a combination of multiple things. So there's definitely a genetic component. You will see that if one member of a family has one of the bipolar disorders, it's a much higher chance that other family members will also have a bipolar disorder. So that will fit into the genetic part. The researchers are looking at some of the very specific neurotransmitters, and this will play into a little bit why certain different drugs are being used. But specifically, they're looking at serotonin and dopamine, and that those are things that are not functioning well in people with bipolar disorder. The good thing with the biological section is that if we know that specifically is what's causing the problem, we can look at specific ways to address the problem, so medications that might be helpful for whichever part of the neurotransmitters are not working well for the individual. There's also some belief that outside factors might cause one of the bipolar disorders to come into play. So it's probably in combination with the other factors though. So if someone is genetically predisposed to having a bipolar disorder, but through their entire life they have a lot of support, they don't have major stress, They might be absolutely fine, and that part of the brain or that genetic component might never be switched on, and it might not actually begin to show symptoms. However, a lot of researchers are believing that if people do have that biological predisposition towards a bipolar disorder, and then they have a significant stress-related event in their life, that might trigger that bipolar to start happening. So the first one that you're going to want to take a look at is Bipolar 1. This starts on page 123. This is probably what we would consider the most significant or the most severe of the bipolar disorders. And that is primarily because we're looking at criteria for manic episodes. Manic is the really, really high feelings of happiness, feelings of I can get anything done, and a lot of lack of judgment. Hypomanic is a little bit lower. It's to the point where you're not necessarily taking risks, and you might have a combination of that manic, hypomanic, or major depressive all happening fairly quickly within each other. One of the most important things for bipolar 1 to know is that you may have psychotic features with this. So you might actually have people that you're meeting with in their bipolar 1, if they're in specifically the manic episode, that they're going to have a break with reality. So be aware that that is a very strong possibility, and you might even want to tease it out from schizophrenia. It might look a little bit like that if that's the point that they're at when they come to see you. So make sure you look at the two of them and separate out which one is really a more appropriate diagnosis. If you're seeing mood disorders, mood swings, look more at the bipolar. Grandiose delusions are very common. Think of the manic episodes when you're feeling like you can do anything, everything's great, you can accomplish anything, you can save the world, you can become a rock star, whatever it might be. You're going to see some of those delusions in that set. Note too that the manic episode is going to result in either a marked impairment of social or occupational functioning, or it may require hospitalization to prevent harm to self or others. So what this might look like is you have a person who's in a manic phase, and suddenly they decide that if they move to Tennessee, everything's going to be great. So now they're breaking social ties. Maybe they don't tell their family that they're going to Tennessee. Maybe they quit their job or just don't show up for their job because they think if they just move to this new location, everything's going to be okay. So it's not well thought out, and they're just making quick decisions that have long-term consequences. You might also notice people that need that hospitalization, so that's preventing harm to self or others. So if you're in that manic episode and you're having psychotic issues, you might think that you can fly, and you might actually go to a roof and decide that you're going to fly. Well, that's something that's going to cause harm to yourself, so that would be a case where we'd want to hospitalize that person. In this manic episode, they're not going to think that they're ill. They're not going to think that they need treatment. As I said earlier, it's usually only when people are in the depressive state that they think that they need help. You'll see this a little bit more often in males. You'll note that there's a really high suicide risk with this population. And it actually happens more, I believe, in the manic phases than in the depressive phases. So like the example I gave earlier, you think you can fly, you jump off of a tall building. That's not an intentional suicide, but it is going to end up being a suicide, categorized as a suicide. It's going to be a harm to self that you would need to hospitalize to prevent from happening. Note again that there's a strong family tie. And if you're looking at the genetic piece, schizophrenia and bipolar might have a similar genetic origin. Bipolar 2 is going to look a little bit different than bipolar 1. You're not going to have a manic episode in bipolar 2. You're also not going to have any of the psychotic features. So you're not going to have that break from reality. What you're going to see more is that cycling between a major depressive episode of at least 2 weeks and then a hypomanic episode of at least 4 days, when they think everything's great, but it's not going to be as excessive as you see in bipolar 1. Individuals will typically come to see a therapist during that depressive episode because, again, they usually like that hypomania. It feels good. It feels like you're getting something done. It feels like life is finally getting better. Note again that there's a lot of impulsivity that's going to contribute to the suicide attempts. Substance use is going to be in both bipolar 1 and 2. So you'll see that for a couple of different reasons. You might see substances being used to try to control the moods. I'm feeling really depressed. I'm going to try to use a substance to make me feel better. Or you might see substances used because nothing can go wrong even if I take this substance. So there's a lot of different reasons that you might see them, but make sure you do a screening for them. It's very common that you'll have a co-occurring disorder of a substance use disorder with one of the bipolar disorders. With both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, you're going to see that this tends to start in late adolescence or adulthood. Average age of onset is mid-20s. If symptoms of this happen earlier, that tends to be a little bit more severe. I would caution you that you will see bipolar diagnoses in much younger children, and that's something I would probably try to avoid if you can. I worked with a 9-year-old who was diagnosed before I met her as having bipolar 1, and she did have some pretty serious symptoms. She would do a lot of the swinging. She had a lot of impulsive behaviors. And I believe she was diagnosed because she had had a psychotic break, and they thought that fit best with the bipolar 1 disorder. But I probably would not have given that diagnosis because she was so young. The other one that you should know about is called cyclothymic disorder. So for cyclothymic disorder, you're going to see people that have numerous periods of that hypomanic symptoms, but they're not long enough to meet that criteria. And then you're also going to have numerous periods of depressive symptoms, and again, it's not going to be enough to meet a criteria for something else. So it's not going to be long enough periods of a depressive symptom to meet a criteria for, say, a major depressive disorder. So essentially we're looking at a long term, so at least 2 years of this fluctuating mood disturbance. You're going back and forth between hypomanic and depressive, and you're not stabilizing in between the two. It is possible that someone will start with cyclothymic disorder and eventually develop bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. So this might be one to use before you go to those diagnoses if it's not quite severe enough or you're not sure which way to go with it. That's really all there is for the bipolar disorders. Make sure you post your questions and any examples you have of these disorders in our case discussion for the week. Have a great week.